All right, there it is. That is my little concession to myself. Suitably epic. Video game soundtrack. You might notice we do a lot of video game music. That's because it doesn't get flagged. So, yeah, that's why. Jeff, are you there?
We've been flagged every other time for not doing video game music.
Yeah. So, this is it. This is the last one. I thought this might be like 10 episodes. And we've gone over... We haven't doubled that. We're on episode 17. But I thought I would be able to combine more chapters than I was able to. And I haven't been able to. So... 17 episodes. This is chapter 20. And, yeah, this is not an audio book, if you don't know. If you're coming in at the end. What we've been doing is talking about the ideas in Tragedy and Hope, and in a more in-depth way than I think has been done elsewhere. More in relation to Quigley's ideas about civilization. I know Dyer has done, Jay Dyer's done the occult side of things. We've been looking a bit more at the history and the technological and the sort of political stuff that Quigley talks about explicitly. And I have been making connections that you can go read the book. You can watch some guy's done the audio book on he's got them up on YouTube. They're okay. His pronunciation on a number of things is awful, but credit to him for reading out loud. He's an amateur guy reading out all of Tragedy and Hope, and recording it for people who can't or won't read it. But I've been making kind of connections and an analysis of this stuff and things that have maybe Quigley didn't make the connections or didn't see the connections, and especially with reference to things that have happened since 1966, because this book's published in 1966. So we're on the last episode. I hope you've enjoyed the ride. Have you enjoyed the ride, Jeff?
I have, for sure. I mean, naturally with these things, there's going to be I don't know about naturally. Well, there's been a drop-off a gradual drop-off in viewership over time.
Oh, really?
But I think, but I think people who stuck with it certainly have been very dedicated, and I think we've all enjoyed the ride. Those of us who stuck it out to the end.
My hope is that the real audience is yet to find this, because I'm the sort of person that if I found something that was like episode, whatever, I'd just wait for it all to be done, and then I'd watch it all over the course of a few days.
Okay. So
there's at least one of us out there that would do that. The last few chapters are weird. I've said this before, and this is the weirdest one for me to do of all the chapters, because Quigley writes in 1966, and the last couple of chapters are difficult to sort of deal with because we know so much more about what was happening in the post-war than Quigley knew. And this one is weird to talk about because, he's looking forward from 1966, which is 58 years ago, and it's hard to look at some of the things he gets right, some of the things he gets wrong. And Quigley is hopeful in 1966. I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end. He's not hopeful in the 1970s. When he writes in the 1970s, he's lost his optimism. But anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So I've called this Hope ? And it's sort of Quigley's vision of sort of what's going to happen for the future. And it's episode 17 of Tragedy and Hope, a Bucklander lecture series. Did you have any more to say?
Now, when you say that Quigley was hopeful, is he hopeful about similar things that people in our audience might be hopeful about, or are they different? Is he concerned about different things?
It's hard to place Quigley in the modern framework. In the way it's be hard to place JFK in the modern framework, right? Because JFK, very, sensible guy, but he would look at he'd look at the Democrats and he'd look at America and he'd be like, "What the hell are you guys doing?" But he wouldn't look at the Republicans and be like, "You guys make sense either." And both America's parties are just insane, and that's true around the world in Western countries. someone had a really good post on Twitter today that said, because El Salvador has just elected Nayib, is it Nayib Bukele or something like that? The president who's just gone, oh, this thing, how we are like the most dangerous country in the world per capita because of crime? What if we enforce the laws? And El Salvador has had a huge drop-off in crime, and it's now one of the safest countries in the world because people said we want our country back. And we have Ilhan Omar in America talking about how, okay, yes, or like The Economist, right? I can't remember which one. Ilhan Omar said that Bukele, what's his name? Let's have a look here because I'm going to mention him. That he represents some sort of threat to democracy. So a president who Nayib Bukele, so when a politician actually does something about crime, he's a threat to democracy. And the New York Times and The Economist have run articles that are like, sure, he's fixed everything in El Salvador. Sure, we can't deny that, but at what cost? And it's like, well, running the country, not letting it fall apart. And these and our parties, my point is not to go on about El Salvador. The point is someone actually starts running a country properly in a not crazy way, and the parties in the West, in the developed world, are like, this is so terrible. Meanwhile, the Republicans, the Oklahoma senator, the border crisis going on down at on the Texas border, and it was looking like something might kick off a week ago, to the point that Jeff got mad at me for talking about it. You have a Republican, Senator Lankford, who's come in, and he's from Oklahoma, and an Oklahoma Republican has put forward this compromise bill that basically just like lets the border crisis continue. It just sort of goes, okay, yeah, just let them keep going in. Neither side is good, and the problem is that even the conservatives, even the guys that are actually like vaguely pursuing the right policies, they're all retards. There's no I don't have a lot of faith in these guys. So where would Quigley be today? I don't know. Is he hoping for the same things that we're hoping for? In the way that, like, Quigley, in the political compass meme sort of way, Quigley just wants to grill. Quigley's a centrist. Just leave me alone. Let's just let's work and that sort of stuff. And there's references Quigley makes that are would not. He makes them jokingly because they're so absurd. At one point, he makes some sort of, I don't know, I can't remember what the example is, but he's like, this can no more change. This example that I'm talking about can no more change into this than a guy can become a woman. So Quigley, if you went back in time and showed Quigley, the LGBT movement, he would not be a fan. I'm quite sure. And at one point, he says, like, one of the bad things that we're in at the moment is this era of perversion, and we got to turn this around. And he says, like, the LGB of the LGBT is a perversion, and it's not good, and it's symptomatic of civilizational decline. And so is Quigley hoping for what we're hoping for? Kinda. But Quigley has a lot more faith in... Quigley has... I don't know if he has faith in managerialism, but he has a belief that managerialism is the only way forward. And that, like, this rationality, and we can get better, and that's the way that we're going to improve things. That's the hope. And of course, as I've said a number of times, Tragedy and Hope is a stage in Quigley's model of civilizations. It's the age of conflict. This is what this history has been. It's the third age of conflict. Normally, a civilization has an age of expansion, and it goes into an age of conflict, and then it goes into the fifth stage, which is the age of the Universal Empire. The West is the only country that's been able to short-circuit that and go back into the age of expansion. And we've done that we've had 3 ages of expansions and 3 ages of conflict. And the question is, the hope is, we can go into a 4th stage of expansion. And I think Quigley wants to say that managerialism, that sort of attitude, the pluralistic economy, can be the basis of a new type of capitalism that can be used to create a surplus for expansion. And I think Quigley backs down from that in the 70s because you get Carter come in, and Carter presides over a lost decade, and you get Reagan coming at the end of it. I think, when does Quigley die? Let me have a look here. Yeah, so he dies in 77. So he doesn't live to see Reagan, and he's and he lives through some pretty disastrous final decade of his life. You have Nixon, right? When does Nixon leave? Nixon leaves 72, 73. And then you have Ford, and Ford is kind of a placeholder. And then Carter comes in, and I think with Quigley didn't like Nixon, and I don't know that he would have thought anything about Ford, and I'm quite sure he kind of thought, like, well, Jimmy Carter's sort of like nominally sort of the good type of Democrat, but he's also just can't seem to make anything work. So it's difficult to say. He's not optimistic. So yeah, that's the long answer to that. But I think had Quigley lived to see the 80s, he might have thought, oh, so actually we do have a chance. We do have a chance. And the 80s till Obama, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, there's a lot of reason to think maybe Quigley's onto something. Maybe we can get into this fourth age of expansion. Clinton's America is amazing. I tell people, you don't know what it's like. You don't understand how good Clinton's America was. So
I think we can see a lot of that optimism reflected in the pop culture as well.
Yeah. And here we are now, and I don't know. I don't know if we are entering into the age of a fourth age of expansion or into the universal empire. I know that a lot of guys out there are going to want to say it's obvious that we're entering into the universal empire. If I were to put on my Peter Zeihan hat, I would say weird bit of both, in that the rest of the world's going to decline, but America's actually going to expand. But in having the ability to expand, it will also make itself like the empire of the age. Peter Zeihan's pretty bullish about America. He thinks that if America can it can power with cheap energy from fracking, it can keep going. There's lots of reasons to be bullish about America. It's got good population replacement. But Quigley is thinking a bit more civilizationally. And I think I don't know. I could, it's so hard to say because something could change, right? There could be a method of expansion that's just down the road that we can't see, right? Like nuclear fission or fusion, whichever, cold fusion. Maybe that will kickstart things. And it might not be good. It might not be something that our guys like either, the method of expansion, right? It could be something that is that our guys would say is very dark and occult, right? It could be something like gene editing. That might open up some like method of expansion. It could be like really
robotics revolution.
Well, robotics in a way, right? Because I would imagine that there's a sort of like a white pill version of robotics and a black pill version of robotics, and like whatever the white pill version looks like, we're not gonna get it, right? So yeah, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say. And it's also because in 58 years things have, history is speeding up all the time. One of the things I wanted to say in one of the Friday episodes I did, I gave a timeline of like the events from the Big Bang to the emergence of civilization, and the intervals between significant like leaps forward keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And it took us Sumer emerged in like 6000 BC. It took us 8,000 years to get from a sort of entry-level civilization to flying. And it's taken us 100 years to go from... It didn't take us 100 years. It took us like 60 or 70 years to go from flying at all the way to the moon, right? And what Quigley would say is that if we could keep our focus on the growth, we could do some incredible things. And I think what happens in the late 60s and early 70s, you get the emergence of race communism, and that has just dragged America down, because America has been forced to turn its eyes inwards. And Western civilization is doing this like inward like examination of like, oh, who are we? And that's been pushed on us by people who hate Western civilization. And so Western civilization is no longer outward looking, it's inward looking. Now, actually, weirdly, my hope is that climate change is here, that it's actually kind of bad. Because I want climate change to come and create some sort of pressure on Western civilization so that Western civilization stops navel gazing and it becomes externally looking again and is forced to innovate and develop in a way that pushes things. Destabilization is really good, right? I said a number of episodes back, dead things are the only things that don't change. They're the only things that don't grow. Growing and change, it's easy to be like, this sucks. I want to go back to 1998 playing my PlayStation, playing Final Fantasy VII. That's where I want to go back to. But can't go back. So you got to learn how to ride the wave. You got to learn how to, surf the Kali Yuga, bro, and hope that we get some sort of positive pressure to look externally again, and we stop this navel gazing and this civilizational guilt. It's more than white guilt. It's so much more fundamentally bigger than race. It's about civilization. It's about the method that the West developed, and I watched this guy. He's a smart guy, clearly, but he's obviously also a moron. I think his name's Kehendi Andrews, and he just was saying he's this black race communist in England, and he just said, we got to get rid of Kant. Now, you don't need to agree with Kant. That's not the point. This guy was not saying, Kant was wrong about this. He just thought, no, we need to, pretend Kant never existed, basically. And that sort of attitude is so... It's not about whiteness. It's about civilization. It's about this sort of non... It's low time preference versus high time preference. It's individualism versus versus singularity, hive mind. It's I don't know. There's a whole. I can't think of anything anymore off the top of my head, but there's a lot there. It's so much more than just they don't like white people. It's they don't like Christianity. They don't like God. They don't like masculinity. They don't like this Western model. So I've been, if there's anything in the chat, now's a good time. I know, Dark. Yeah. I wish we could pretend. I wish we could go back in time and get rid of Marx. I can't claim that, Renegade. I don't know who coined the term. But anyway, all right. Why do we have reason not to be hopeful? But actually, that might not be the right way to put it. Quigley is not unhelpful. Okay. Last time we did the Cuban Missile Crisis, parallels of Ukraine, Khrushchev, Kennedy. Quigley doesn't get into Kennedy, though, because I don't think he understands. He doesn't have perspective on Kennedy or the assassination. That's an episode to do. Kennedy stuff. And the fall of the empires and how they kind of just killed themselves by taking, young colonials to Paris and London, having them be taught by Marxists, and they went back and they went, these Marxists taught us how to destroy our empire, to destroy their empires, and the Marxists loved it. And today, so okay, Quigley's hopes, the international hope, the American hope, and the European hope. That's the way to sort of think of these, and then the conclusion. Before we do that, though, we're going to look at something Quigley talks about. I've referenced it before, which is the idea that why we should expect a sort of shift towards more of an authoritarianism. Quigley is not anti-authoritarianism. So I don't, and it sort of feeds with his managerialism. So I don't think that this is a tragedy for Quigley, but I also am not sure that's really a hope. But I wanted to talk about it here again. So in the year 1000, this is Croix de Chevalier, which was the castle of the Knights Templar in the Crusades, and this is built in the 1100s, and it's probably the greatest castle ever built. In around the year 1000, the pinnacle of weapons technology is the castle. And what that means for politics is that it's actually not super hard to build yourself a castle. And what it means is that the size of political units are built around castles. Now, around the year 1000, the ability to overthrow castles with siege weapons sort of starts to increase. So Quigley says there's a couple of spectrums of weapons, and I'm only going to talk about two tonight. One is defensive and offensive, and one is professional armies and mass armies. Now, when we have a shift towards defensive weapons, Quigley says we should expect to have political units become smaller, because there's an ability for smaller and smaller groups to defend themselves from external threats, which pushes more of a community, smaller a balkanization of politics. And the castle is that thing that allows this to happen from the end of the Roman Empire until about the year 1000. So that's why you see Europe break up. Around the year 1000, there's a shift back towards offensive weaponry, particularly with the knight. And you have political units starting to get bigger and bigger. Now, I'm sorry, Orthobros, but this is one of the cannons that is used by the Turks to overthrow Constantinople. With around the time of the fall of Constantinople, you have an increase in offensive weaponry over that time, and so you have countries getting bigger and bigger, political units getting bigger and bigger. But the other thing that happens is the weapons that are available become more and more expert, and that expert weaponry versus weaponry that is easily usable by citizen armies has this exchange where you need to get as many guys under arms as possible when weapons are easy to use, because your opponent will as well. And that means that you have to get your own citizenry under arms. So you have to make concessions to them, which shifts towards more of a democratic system. When you can when you can dominate with a small professional army, Quigley says we have the shift towards authoritarianism because it's sort of they don't have to make these concessions. This is a painting from the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was this sort of a moment things are shifting back towards the democratic, but they're not really there yet. And you have very professional armies because the musket is there, but the musket is still in a fairly primitive form, and it needs very highly trained guys to use them. So you have a fairly professional army, very authoritarian princes fighting one another. This moves. This is the Battle of Valmy. And the Battle of Valmy is one of the most important battles, maybe the most important battle you've never heard of. The Battle of Valmy is when the French Revolution has happened, and there's this grand coalition. Everybody, even guys that hate each other, like look at the French Revolution and go, "We got to go stamp that out," because they know that that's a really bad precedent. But the French Revolution happens at a moment when the weaponry on hand is very much in favor of mass armies. And you have these incredibly large armies by comparison to 100 years earlier. You have very large armies fighting one another. And they need these citizenry cooperating. And the Battle of Valmy is when the French with these citizen soldiers go out and beat the professional armies of Europe, of Austria and Prussia, I believe. And they kind of cement the French Revolution. Napoleon rises after the Battle of Valmy. Napoleon is just, he's on the scene, but he's not yet one of the triumvirate, whatever they call them. Now this goes on, and it really reaches its peak with the First World War and the Second World War. And the thing with these mass wars, these democratic wars, is that they have to, by necessity, this is bothering me. They have to, by necessity, be total wars. Because if you're going to go to Bill, the shopkeeper, and you're going to say to him, we're going to put you under arms, and we're going to go send you around the world and potentially die for some very mercantilist goals. He's going to look at you like you're crazy. You have to go to them, and you have to go to you have to make some sort of existential proposal. You have to say to them, you need to go and die for freedom. You need to go and die in the Ukraine so that Ukraine can have gay marriage. Right? It's that kind of level of thing. Like, you know, oh, they hate us for our freedoms. They don't hate us for our freedoms. Osama bin Laden didn't hate us for our freedoms. He hated us because there were American soldiers in Saudi Arabia, which he thought was blasphemy. They don't care. They're not. You think Muslims are offended because, just to pick an example off the top of my head, there's a video going around Twitter of an Australian girl who goes, I just broke up with my boyfriend, and I've had a 10-day vacation in Europe, and I've slept with 22 people. My goal was 20. You think Muslims are annoyed that white women sleep with 22 men, of 22 people in 10 days? They don't care. In fact, they kind of like it. No, they don't kind of like it. They love it. Because they because what they're doing is they're drawing a circle, and they're going, inside this circle are my friends, and I want my friends, I want my civilization to behave in a certain way, because it is beneficial to my civilization to act that way. It is beneficial for my friends to act this way. If you're outside of that circle, I don't care what you're doing. In fact, I want you to act in self-destructive ways. Now, I have heard some people question the testimony of Yuri Bezimov, that guy that goes around that video, the KGB defector, who's interviewed by the FBI and the CIA, where he says, well, we funded a lot of this stuff. We funded the KGB funded your women's liberation movement. It funded your black nationalist movement. It funded this crazy group of evangelical Christians who said, above all else, we should support Israel for eschatological purposes. We funded all of those because it was like they were like these sort of like venture capitalist moves for us. It wouldn't cost a lot for us to get this ball rolling, and if just one of them took off, we knew that this would be damaging to your society. The Soviets admittedly pursued rather damaging things because out of Soviet ideology, and there's a really interesting article about marriage in the Soviet Union, which was written by a woman, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but like it was really easy to get divorced in the Soviet Union, and there was always a lot of abortion, and it was crazy. Like, it was very self-destructive behavior. I don't think they clued onto it. I don't think they could see it. Likewise with Mao, the one-child policy. It's a good idea for China in the short term when you have 1 point something billion people and ever expanding, and you gotta put the brakes on that because it's too many people. Like the economic projections, I don't know that Mao thought about it at this level. I think Mao just sort of one day on the toilet went, maybe there's too many people, and sure, let's just cut that. But the Chinese are now paying the price for that. Their population is tanking. They have one of the lowest replacement rates in the world, and population decline. I don't think is inherently bad from an economic point of view, but it's population decline at a certain rate is disastrous.
The other problem is that there's no way to ever. It's really easy to cut a population down. It's very difficult to pump a population back up.
Right.
You see that throughout history. Every government that's tried, whether through incentives or taxes or whatever, it's never worked.
And as Peter Zion points out, I'm not like a super Zion bro, but he says a number of things that just seem irrefutable to me. And as he points out, if you need 30-year-olds, you need to make them 30 years ago. You can't make 30-year-olds today. And unfortunately, Western countries think they can by importing, infinity immigrants. And Peter Zeihan says, this is great, immigration's great, and Quigley does too, because they think that it's all just culture, but that there's a pretty much like a one-for-one kind of thing going on with like Anglo-Saxons and Mexicans. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think you can import, Latinos and expect them to behave like Americans. So there's some sort of naivety on the part of Zion and Quigley. I think in a lot of ways Zion picks up a lot of Quigley. He might be Quigley like 2.0, but you should be much more skeptical of anything Zion tells you than what Quigley tells you, because Zion is, I'm quite sure, some sort of contractor for the CIA, and he's like admitted that he's worked with them. So
he's also an eternal American cheerleader. So
yeah.
He's never had a bad thing to say about him.
Oh, and the things he says about Britain are so... I don't mean like the things he says about Britain in the future. They might very well be right. But what he has to say about British history is so retarded. It makes me yell at my computer when I listen to it. The average American is incredibly stupid when it comes to European history. I watched the thing. I don't remember if I talked about this last time. I watched Vivek Ramaswamy talk about what he thought the American Revolution was, that like why America was so good, because it was, freedom against this old world European authoritarianism, which is like, stay in your lane, Vivek. You don't know what you're talking about. Because absolutism in Europe doesn't exist until like the 30 Years' War. Things are getting more absolutist, but the peak of absolutism is Louis XIV. And Americans hear king and they think like tyrant, absolutist tyrant. Before Louis XIV, there were the parliaments of France, which were this huge problem for the king. The English king has always had to deal with Parliament. There's the Barons' Rebellion in the 1200s, which is like saying to King John, "No, shut up. You're not a dictator of us." And this the ideas about freedom that America thinks it invented in 1776 go back into the dark mists of the Germanic forests. I'm not saying they're English, because the English are Germanic. I'm saying they're older than the English. The English, the Anglo-Saxons begin their identity sometime around the year 500 when they start to establish the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England. I'm saying it's even older than that. It goes back into... Yeah, and let me tell you, if you think the Roman Empire are the good guys, I'm going to argue with you. I'm going to disagree. I'm happy to have that argument. I think the Germanic people coming in and kicking over the Roman Empire is awesome. I love it, because the Germanics are the ones who bring these ideas of freedom. Everything that you value, these notions that you value, if you care about your autonomy as a person, if you care about freedom of speech, if you care about the right to bear arms, those are all the ideas of a bunch of crazy German guys who invade Europe. They invade the Roman Empire. They invade England, and a couple of hundreds of years later, they invade America, and they invade Australia, and they invade Canada, and they invade New Zealand. These are the it goes back to Hengist and Horsa and earlier. So Vivek Ramaswamy doesn't know what he's talking about. So here's the question, right? This is the point.
Autonomy to do what, though, is what Chris G says. Autonomy to do what? So that is another question that comes after, because
whatever they want that is not going to impact on their neighbors in an overly detrimental way. There's King Canute, I think, who was a Viking king of England.
Vinland Saga.
So Germanic. Okay, I don't get the reference, Jeff.
Oh, it's an anime that's about King Canute. Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
King Canute had this law. He had a number of laws. He famously went and he ordered the sea not to come in, right? And he ordered the tide to stop. And a lot of people go, "Oh, he was obviously crazy." And a lot of people point to this as like, especially Americans. A lot of Americans point to King Canute and go, "See, kings are crazy, and they think that they should be able to order the tides to stop rolling in." The more nuanced interpretation of that event, and the one that makes much more sense to me, is, and there's some evidence for this, is that the expectations that King Canute's um, vassals had of him were growing and growing and growing. And King Canute took them to the sea, and he ordered the sea not to come in, and the tide came in, and he sort of turned around and said, "Are you starting to see what the limitations of my power are? Do you think I can? This is a reality check. I can't. There's certain things I am not able to do." That makes a lot more sense to me. These guys were sophisticated. We have this idea that I hope nobody listening to this has this idea after 17 episodes of Tragedy and Hope. But a lot of people, the average person, has this idea that these people were unsophisticated. They were stupid. They would, I think in many ways they were far more sophisticated than we are. They had an appreciation of the language of symbols and culture and allegory in a way that we don't, in a way that we've been taught to forget, because it's good for us to forget symbols, because we forget the language of symbols at a conscious level, but we still are being communicated to at a subconscious level. And so by teaching people not to be able to communicate with symbols consciously, you then open up a way of brainwashing them subconsciously. And you can start to slip things in through the media and through laws. This is kind of an example, but the symbolism of the right to bear arms is incredibly significant. Because if you were a Germanic person, the symbol of your status as a free man is whether or not you can carry a sword. The ability to own a gun, therefore, in the 21st century, is the equivalent of being a free man. And anybody that wants to take away, this is a really boomer Republican point, but for one, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Anyone that wants to take away your gun wants you to be a slave, and it doesn't even matter that they would use physical force against you. That's secondary. My concern is the symbology of it. And I think at a subconscious level, people know without guns I'm a slave. And they'll be more prone to act as slaves. So the how did I get on this? Symbolism, Canute. But another law that Canute had was that, and I think this is a great idea. This is one of the cornerstones of Western civilization, as far as I'm concerned. Canute had a law that he said everyone should be able to hang his gold on his fence and leave and be safe in the knowledge that when he comes back, his gold will still be there. But it should be illegal for anyone to hang his gold on his fence to tempt his neighbors with. So, there's a very, it might not be immediately obvious, but there's a very important thing there, that you ought to be safe in and secure in your possessions and your place and your status and your family, but you ought not to flaunt those things. And that had something to do with something you said that I can't remember now.
Well, the original question in chat was autonomy to do what?
Autonomy.
I think
so that's sort of my point about autonomy. That like there's common sense, autonomy to. Though the framers of the Constitution don't do a bad job at describing it, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I just think they happen to not understand what those words meant. But those are unobjectionable words to the Germanic mindset. So that's what I would say. The autonomy to do those things. So okay, so is there any more from chat before I go on?
No. Cool.
Okay. By the way, I'm looking at. Oh! I see what the problem is. I'm just looking at my. I paused my stream, so it's stuck on the first slide. Okay, so the other thing to say is it's stuck on that these citizens' armies require total war. Now, what Quigley one of the moments why we should have hope for an increasingly professional army, right? And this seems I just picked a kind of a cool picture here. Credit to the guy who drew this. Like hyper technological future warriors are going to be rather, I'm guessing, professional forces. I don't expect the average guy to be able to afford this, and there's going to be, training involved, high barriers of entry. But one of the reasons Quigley thinks that this gives us a reason to be optimistic is that elite wars can be fought in much more subtle and controlled ways. Quigley kind of is in favor of the idea of mutually assured destruction as a deterrent, because it kind of takes off the table general conflict. He says nobody can win a general conflict in 1966, and that seems to be true today, right? I wouldn't. They've been talking the last few weeks in the UK. I don't know what they've been saying in Canada or America about this, although I know America's recruitment amongst white males is at an all-time low. Their recruitment amongst every other demographic is doing just fine compared to what it was in the previous years. It's more or less stable, but white men have dropped from like 60,000 recruits a year to 40 something, and they've sort of which was the biggest number, right? The biggest demographic in America in terms of like potential military recruits is white men, because women don't join up in the same numbers, and whites are still the largest group in America. And white men have gone, oh, we're starting to get the message. You don't want us. You just, yeah, sure, you want us to go die, but we're not going to go die for your bullshit. Or we're not going to die for a country that shits on us. And I don't know what Canada's talking about, but in the UK, they're talking about a draft, which is insane, and because we might have to fight a conventional war against Russia, and it's insane. It's the craziest proposition. We're not going to fight a conventional war against Russia. God help us, because the conventional war will not last a very long time before shit starts to really hit the fan. But so what Quigley says, though, is that we're entering into this age of controlled conflicts, and he's talking about the Cold War. And I think it kind of holds in certain areas still today, like these sort of proxy wars, and we kind of seem to be engaging in it with Iran right now. not really Russia. If we're doing it, I mean, we are doing it through Ukraine, but Iran's Iran has been supporting the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and they drone striked a American base in Jordan a couple of days ago, and 3 guys died. Three soldiers died there, and the Americans retaliated by striking places in Syria and Iraq. So it's sort of controlled warfare, but what you can do with professional soldiers, with small professional armies, is you can conduct more specific goals. And as Quigley said yesterday with the Cuban, or not yesterday, last time with the Cuban Missile Crisis, a good diplomat leaves his opponent intact, because it's better for JFK to leave Kennedy still at the head of the Politburo, because he knows Khrushchev at the head of the Politburo. He knows Khrushchev. He's a known quantity. He knows how to operate with him. And it's easier to deal with someone like that. You don't want to push so hard that there's a revolution and the guys that you were dealing with are overthrown. And Quigley's belief is that we can sort of start to make common cause with the Soviet Union going forward. Before I talk about that, I just want to briefly speculate on the sort of weapons dynamic. And so I talked about this offensive and defensive, and then professional and mass mobilization armies. And I want to think briefly about, what's the future of that? What does it look like? Well, the closest thing I can really think of about what the sort of next sort of stage of warfare will look like, at least in a direct way. There is hybrid warfare happening all the time, and in ways that are hard to see or predict. But information warfare against our country's own citizens. But anyway, at least in the military terms, my thought is that a war with Russia might not even look like nukes. It's just going to be one day you wake up and the electricity doesn't work because the Russians have hit the go button on, the virus they infiltrated into the power grid 15 years ago. And just things will just not work. And so I think the future way to think about these sorts of things is like computers. But whether or not computers act as whether or not you actually need to be, whether or not they lend themselves to a professional or a mass mobilization type system, I think is debatable, because I think you can potentially teach enough people that they're accessible enough that they can sort of act as an anti-authoritarian type of weapons platform. But I also think that there's ways of controlling the information flows on the internet that act as a pro-authoritarian instrument. And then the flip side of that, on the other axis, the sort of defensive and offensive. How good is an individual hacker at infiltrating offensively into certain networks, and how good can an individual be at protecting their own information and attacks? It's all open. It's an open debate. I don't mean to come down on one side or the other. I think it's just something to think about and something to pay attention to, that these sorts of things are very much at play. And I'm not sure that it's yet obvious. I mean, someone who knows more about technology, feel free to say something in chat if you're in the chat. But it seems very much to me like computers as a weapons platform are very much an open at stake. They're very much in play. And then to take it a step further, I don't think even a lot of people who know a lot about computers, and I don't really, but it seems to me from a sort of like theoretical point of view at least, that a lot of people are not taking into account blockchain, right? Like what blockchain can do, and I mean everybody's talking about AI. I'm a little bit like, if people are talking this much about AI, it might be kind of like a non-factor because they're talking about it. This is when I start to go down the rabbit hole, and I just start spinning around. Do we know about it because they want us to know about it? Because it doesn't matter? Or do they want us to know about it because if it's out in the open, we won't think it's an issue? You know what I mean? The spiral. So I don't know. But I just mean to I just present that, and I'm gonna leave it there unless there's anything in chat about it. I'll try to drink in case. So, what we have here then is more or less the Cold War when Quigley's writing this book. And the thing to see here is that there's some sort of equilibrium that has emerged. There's a proxy war being fought in Vietnam, and it's getting hotter and hotter every day. It's going to reach its height under Lyndon Johnson, who is president when Quigley's writing, but it's not really at its peak yet. It's getting there, and Nixon's going to come in and sit on top of it. But I don't know that Nixon's ever really that interested in Vietnam, and he starts to wind it down. I get the impression as soon as he can. But you have on this map now, China's gray. I don't know why Australia and New Zealand are not blue in this, but China is not really I'm just now kind of looking at chat. Sorry, Dark. So China has sort of fallen out of line with the Soviet Union. India's very annoying. There are pressures starting to build in the non-aligned world. And Quigley thinks that in 1966, looking forwards, that what can happen is that America and the USSR are growing closer and closer together as a and that actually they increasingly want the same things. And Quigley thinks that one of the things that can happen is after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he says it's evident that America is the most powerful country on the block. That the Soviets will basically allow America to win the Cold War. Quigley kind of says that, but because what the Soviets are really interested in is maintenance of power in the Soviet Union. They want to keep control. And he doesn't say this explicitly, but this goes back to Stalin's view, right? The revolution happens in the wrong country. The revolution is supposed to happen in Britain or Germany because they are the two most industrialized countries on the planet. And the proletariat of the masses is supposed to rise up from factory workers. The problem for Marx is that actually the factory workers are quite comfortable compared to a lot of peasants. And it's really like the Russian dregs of society that are used for the revolution. And so the revolution starts in Russia, where it was not supposed to happen. And Russia then has this debate within itself, within the party, the Communist Party. What do we do? Do we cement the revolution at home and allow the Soviet Union to function as a base for a snowballing world revolution that will happen slowly, and that we don't risk it? That, because that's what Stalin wants, and Stalin then develops the communism in one country to make the Soviet Union self-sustaining and able to support communist parties around the world, but at a sustainable rate. Or do we go whole hog now and risk it all? And that's what Trotsky wants, and that's the big debate between the two of them. Jeff, do I hear you wanting to make a point?
Actually, no, I didn't touch anything.
Oh, I thought I heard something. Okay.
So yeah, keep going, and then we'll come back to what's going on in chat. I think.
Okay.
Finish off this point, and we'll go back to
Okay. But what needs to happen, though, Quigley says, is America needs to get better at managing these sort of global events. He says there in 1966, somebody has come up with a list of 29 crises, and of these 29, Russia has caused 8, and America has caused 11. And where the other 10 come from, he doesn't say. But I'll just leave it with this little. I'll leave this point. In this way, the superpower neutralization and the included nuclear stalemate will continue into the future. From this flow 3 consequences. 1. Movement of Soviet-Western rivalry down to lower, less violent levels of conflict and competition. 2. Continued disintegration of the two superblocks from the inability of the chief power in each to bring force against its allies because of the need to accept growing diversity within each bloc in order to retain as much as possible the appearance of unity within the bloc. This process is well illustrated by Moscow's difficulties with China, Albania, and now Romania, or by Washington's troubles with de Gaulle or with its Latin American empires. And 3, a growing independence of the neutrals and uncommitted nations because of their ability to act freely in the troubled waters stirred up by the Soviet-American confrontation. So in some ways, America and the USSR have more in common with one another in just trying to manage the world and their blocs than they do with any other country. And so that's sort of... That managing of the situation is what's at stake. Okay, that's a good point. I don't know if
there's also something
a ton more, but
yeah, I mean the similarity there is also the level of ideological commitment that both America and Soviet Union were having at the time, whereas a lot of countries, they're just trying to make their country run properly, make the trains run on time.
Well, and I think that happens.
Whereas
I think there's a shift that's happening in the late 60s and 70s where America's entering into the crisis of the middle class, but also the Soviets are, if I'm correct, the Soviet standard of living is getting better. So America's kind of starting to fall a bit, and the Soviets are starting to get a bit better. And they're starting to meet, and they're just sort of like, how Americans just sort of like, well, we want to turn inwards and fix our problems a bit more. And the Soviet citizenry is like, we're enjoying this increase in standard of living. We don't want to go and like fight any wars. We don't want to jeopardize this. But is that sort of what you're?
So they both kind of become inward looking, you're saying?
Yeah. I think Brezhnev is much more insular than Stalin or Khrushchev. But Stalin was actually quite insular as well. Stalin, especially the Stalin Quigley points. Stalin's happy to support, Stalinists around the world. But he also is very paranoid from the 30s onwards particularly about the British putting together some coalition to destroy him. And we talked about this in previous episodes. The British were actually quite interested in using fascism as a buffer against communism, and just sort of pointing Hitler east was sort of the British hope. The British were kind of looking for a way to get out of the Second World War, or factions of the British were looking to get out of the Second World War. And that's kind of a spoiler, because I'm reading a book right now that's very interesting that's about Rudolf Hess's flight to Britain in 1941, and his attempt to negotiate a peace with the British. More on that. Stay tuned. Watch this space, because I think that's definitely potential for an episode. There's big factions of the British establishment that are not interested in fighting the Germans, and if they can kind of find a way of creating a way for Germany to go through Poland and into the Soviet Union, they're more than happy to do that. Khrushchev plays the big man, but he plays it, Quigley says, for the consumption of people at home. I think Brezhnev, though, in particular, is the beginning of a lack of interest globally, though. I'm really talking off the top of my head, though. There's certainly maybe a little thing to be done about post Khrushchev events in the Soviet Union. Brezhnev and whoever that guy was between Brezhnev and Gorbachev. I can't. There's one or two very minor guys that like nobody remembers between Brezhnev and Gorbachev. So yeah, they are insular, inward looking. So what's going on in chat?
So going back to chat, Renegade made the point. We're going back to the point about the next attack being something like a major cyber attack. Renegade makes the point that computing is definitely a weapon in the modern age. That's mostly because there hasn't been a digital Pearl Harbor, so very few defenses. Once something big happens, defenses on all sides will greatly increase.
I'm open to that. I'm so kind of like I don't know what like big defenses in terms of cyber look like, because, and I know like people always say like, well, it's not enough, but like it could already be.
I think it looks like something like I think it could take the form of something like anti-fragility. Because right now we have these big national systems, these big international networks, and it makes it like that if something fails, it fails, and it affects a lot of people. It affects maybe the entire nation. So, because there's always been this assumption that no one's going to be able to take out the entire eastern seaboard or something like that.
You really need some sort of decentralized, and I know there are like crypto efforts to do this. Holocoin is sort of like the thing that comes to mind, like a decentralized internet. The internet is it Internet 2.0 or Internet 3.0 or something like that.
Yeah, they're talking 3.0 now.
I don't even know it. So what was 1.0 like DARPA net and that sort of stuff, and 2.0 is the internet as we've known
2.0
it.
is the ubiquitous internet, right?
Okay.
Or is 3.0 the ubiquitous?
Well, I think whatever is next 0.0 is like supposed to be very decentralized, and that makes sense. But then the question is actually, well, what about China's Great Firewall? I mean, I know you can get around it. I know, and like everybody does get around it, but does the firewall do any good for China's defenses, or does it in some way make it more fragile once you do get around it? I don't know. It's so difficult to say with these things, because the minute you start questioning, it's so easy to spiral, as I said. Like, I'll give you an example of a tangible weapons technology. The F-30...
Chris G says this next segment is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Link in the description. Promo code IAA.
Yeah, I'm happy to have ExpressVPN sponsor us. The F-35, it's cooled down a lot, the chat about the F-35, but there was a lot of time being spent talking about the F-35 as a waste of money and like a failed weapons platform. And like somebody pointed out, actually, it's in the U.S. Air Force's interests to have everybody think that the F-35 is a paper tiger. But then, but it's also in their interest. You know what I mean? Like, it's so easy to start to spiral out of control on these things. It's like that scene from what is it? Here we go. It's like the scene from The Princess Bride, right? Like, but you know I would have. You know I would have. You would have switched the poison because you knew I would take yours, and you know what I'm talking about. I hope, please, someone in chat must have seen The Princess Bride.
You know, I'm a few years older than you, but you're way more Gen X than I am.
Yeah, because I have a Gen X. My brother's Gen X, and I'm Gen Y. My brother's young Gen X, and I'm old Gen Y. So, this is the scene I'm talking about. A classic. The Princess Bride is a wonderful movie. Maybe I might introduce Mrs. Bucklander to it for Valentine's Day. That might be my plan. But yeah, it's just so easy. It's a scene in which the character, the guy who's got his back to us, or puts poison in one of the cups, and the guy sort of tries to figure out which poison cup he's put it into. And the culmination of the scene is that the cup that he drinks has the poison in it, but it's because the masked character has put poison in both cups because he's developed a tolerance to the poison by having a little bit every day, and actually that's quite a good analogy for spiraling. At the end of the day, they're both we're fucked both ways. However it goes. But that's let's have a look at chat. It's difficult for me to juggle chat and the slides and my notes, because all my notes are written down. How many would be able to get around an ISP block on a certain web address? Probably less than 5%. I have only recently been bothered to be able to get a VPN. It was I so rarely actually care about anything that I need a VPN to get around, but I can do it. But I think you're right. I think the Renegade probably less than 5%. But what's interesting about that number is not the intellect, but the but the sort of like maybe I serve as a good example of this, like the belief or in themselves or the motivation or the ability to be bothered. I don't know. Christy, is that you made one of the classic blunders a reference to? Yeah, we live in this age of just ennui.
It's kind of like how we're still on Discord. Our community is still on Discord when we know that Discord is, first of all, owned by the Chinese, and second of all, many communities have been just like, disappeared overnight. But, we kind of run on the assumption that tomorrow our Discord's still going to be there, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after. And it's, there's always a chance that it could go away, but
we do need some like dead man switch that like puts us all in touch with one another if something happens.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the deal. If the internet ever goes down, on the next New Year's Eve, let's all meet at the top of the Empire States Building. Anyway, I think you're right. Yeah, there's something to be done there. There's something to be talked about there. I don't know. You ever thought about how like all the people that you played games with or you used to talk to online? You ever wondered how many of them are just like died? I think about that sometimes, and like how some of these guys, I wonder what they're I don't know, because it was anyway. Moving forwards, not a lot. I mean, there's a lot of pages here, but I'm summarizing them now. The second part of Quigley, of this chapter for Quigley, is the crisis of the American middle class. Quigley really thinks like the problem, the way to describe the decline in the American middle class is, he calls it Africanization. What he means by that is this decline of these abstract cultural ideas and obligations, and the return to a sort of primitive set of family and tribal obligations that you only really owe things to the people that you know. Now, that doesn't... I can understand why you might think that initially, but like it's sort of not objectionable. But I see it all the time in England, and it gets worse every day. And I'm always complaining. Jeff just dropped. I'm going to keep going. Can somebody give me a thumbs up so I know it's... Oh, there we go. Jeff's back. There's a certain type of person that's like, oh. Can everyone hear me? Renegade, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me or something? The people often say to me like, oh, you're worrying about this, how does it impact you? Blah blah blah. Even my people that are conservative, even my friends that are conservative, say this sort of thing to me. And it'll be over little things. It'll be that person did that. Or, one of the things that's driving me crazy is there's a street by me where the parking inspectors are notorious. It's the cafe I hang out on. The cafe I hang out in, the street out that it's on is patrolled very heavily by parking attendants. It's like the main street, and you park in one area, and there will be a parking attendant to give you a ticket in 5 or 10 minutes. And a couple of guys have clued into the fact that they can park on the pavement, and the English parking attendants can't give tickets to parking on the pavement. So these guys have just like figured out some genius hack of the system. Now, this in and of itself is not a big thing, but it's what is civilization? I mean, if in one way civilization is the aggregate of all these little behaviors that are greater than the sum of their parts. And when these little things start to go, a little trickle can become a flood, and before you know it, this sort of banked capital of civilization is gone. And it's over little things. And that's what I take Quigley's Africanization to be here. There's a lot of really good stuff in here to talk about in the middle class, but it's too much to read out. I mean, Quigley talks about migration increasingly becoming an issue. I'll read that paragraph. One development in political life during the next generation or so that will be difficult to document is concerned with the very nature of the modern sovereign state. Like so much of our cultural heritage from the 17th century, such as international law and Puritanism, this may now be in the process of a change so profound as to modify its very nature. As understood in Western Europe over the last 3 centuries, the state was the organization of sovereign power on a territorial basis. Sovereign meant that the state or ruler had supreme legal authority to do just about anything regarded as public, and this authority impinged directly on the subject or citizen without any intermediaries or buffer corporations, and did this in a dualistic power antithesis typical of the Greek two-valued logic that was applied to almost everything in the 17th century. As part of the sovereign system, it was assumed that rights of property and a permanent association were not natural or eternal, but flowed from grants of sovereign power. Thus, property and land required the state's recognition in the form of a document or deed, and no corporation could exist except at the charter of the sovereign or with his tacit consent. Moreover, all citizens on the territory were subject to the same sovereign power. The latter consisted, as it still largely does in our tradition, of a mixture of force, military, economic rewards, and ideological uniformity. This view of public authority is by no means universal in the world, and shows strong indications that it may be changing in the West. Corporations exist and have the earliest mark of divinity, brackets immortality, and have become, as they were in the non-sovereign Middle Ages, refuges where individuals may function shielded from the reach of the sovereign state. The once almost universal equivalence between residence and citizenship may be weakening. If the ideological state continues to develop its likely characteristics, persons of different ideologies and thus of different allegiances may become intermingled on the same territory. The number of refugees and resident aliens is now increasing in most countries. It goes on and on and on. And these sections blend together, so I'm trying to bring the two together. I'll read this as well. This is more than enough on the power patterns in our near future. We must now turn to a much briefer discussion of the patterns of economic and social life. There we see most extraordinary contrast. While the economic life of Western society has been increasingly successful in satisfying our material needs, the social aspect has become increasingly frustrating. There was a time not long ago where the chief aims of most Western men was for greater material goods and for rising standards of living. This was achieved at great social costs by the attrition or even destruction of much of social life, including the sense of community, fellowship, leisure, and social amenities. Looking backwards, we are fully aware of these costs in the original factory towns and urban slums. But looking about us today, we are often not aware of the great, often intangible costs of middle-class life in suburbia or in the dormitory environs that surround European cities. The destruction of social companionship and solidarity, the narrowing influence of exposure to persons from a restricted age group or from a narrow segment of social classes, the horrors of commuting, the incessant need for constant driving about to satisfy the ordinary needs of the family for groceries, medical care, entertainment, religion, or social experience, the prohibitive costs and inconvenience of upkeep and repairs, and in general, the whole way of life of the suburban rat race, including the large-scale need for providing artificial activities for children. Rebellion of this rat race has already begun, not from the lower middle class who are just entering it and still aspire to it, but from the established middle class who have, as they say, had it. On the whole, the efforts to find a way out while still retaining a high standard of material living have not been successful, and the real rebellion is coming, as we shall see later, from their children. There have expanded the usual adolescent revolt against parental dominance and authority into a large-scale rejection of parental values. One form that this revolt has taken has been to modify the meaning of the expression high standard of living to include a whole series of desires and values that are not material, and thus were excluded from the 19th century bourgeois understanding of the expression standard of living. Among these are two we have already listed as disconcerting elements in the Africans' understanding of standard living: small group interpersonal relationship and sex play. These changes, as we shall see, come to represent a challenge to the whole middle class outlook. Later, in every, I'm giving you the greatest hits of this chapter now because I really thought about how to put all of this into words, and Quigley just, it is a great chapter.
I think a lot of this actually goes back to that earlier question of autonomy to do what, because in the Christian view, the Christian view of history is actually of mankind is teleological, right? It's eschatological, in that the kingdom of heaven is being coming to earth, being manifest on earth is the end point of history. But with the American sense or the American concept of autonomy, it's this teleological. It's now you have complete freedom and you can pursue your own idiosyncratic little, your own little, manifest your will in your own way.
I think if Quigley is Catholic culturally, if you want to try and fit Quigley into an eschatology, if he thought that there was a God, if he was actually more than just culturally Catholic, he would be an amillennial. And I think he would say that there's some sort of amillennial process of us doing it ourselves. And God's acting, but with us. And we have to kind of like build the kingdom ourselves.
Sure. I mean, yeah, even the Orthodox conception, like there's a what do you call it? A synergy, right?
Yeah.
That God works through us, and there's a synergy. Yeah.
And the hope for Quigley is that not America, but Western civilization as embodied in America can kind of capture this promise. So okay, Spangler says something interesting in the beginning of The Decline of the West. He says, Western man has a view of history that no other group has. He's the only person that can stop and like look backwards and forwards in a way that other civilizations don't engage in. And he then goes on to say that only, and this book, in this like meta point, he goes, even this book, Decline of the West, is a product of Faustian civilization. You know, the Aztecs would not have written Decline of the West because they did not have the sense of history that is captured in Decline of the West. And so Quigley is, I think, kind of doing the same thing. That he is giving us a model of civilization that could only be produced by the West. And in doing so, I think he's... And I'm really grasping at straws as I say this. But I think what he would kind of say is what you're talking about, like teleology and eschatology, are very much tied up with this Western civilization view of them. And you can't get outside of them. You can't get outside of the Western civilization view of these eschatologies, or the eschatology and teleology. And so there's like this sort of feedback cycle, and round we go.
So you could say that one of the hopes in Tragedy and Hope is that Western civilization is the only civilization that views history in this manner, and therefore it has the hope of
definitely
saving itself from its own.
Definitely, 100%. I wasn't ready for. That's a really, and that's the perfect way of putting it. Like it is that Western civilization somehow embodies principles of Christianity, and even if you're an atheist, in some ways Western civilization functions as Christ for the world, in that there's some sort of like awareness and sacrifice that Western civilization can make for the benefit of the world. If you see what I'm saying, not to make too like I'm not trying to make a heretical point, or even that Quigley would have made that heretical point, but there's kind of like a parallel with what Christ is to men, Western civilization is to other civilizations.
Yeah, you can kind of see that in that if the world is going to become Christian, it's going to become Christian through Western civilization.
That's too.
That's kind of how
too. Yeah.
A lot of the world has become Christian. Yeah.
And Quigley talked. I'll skip what I was going to read and get to this bit, because this sort of really addresses what you're talking about. From this examination of the tradition of the West, we can formulate the pattern of outlook on which this tradition is based. It has 6 parts. 1. There is a truth, a reality. Thus, the West rejects skepticism, solipsism, and nihilism. 2. No person, group, or organization has the whole picture of the truth. Thus, there is no absolute or final authority. I would not conflate that with theology. I think he's talking very much sort of epistemically, not spiritually. 3. Every person of goodwill has some aspect of the truth, some vision of it from the angle of his own experience. Thus, each has something to contribute. 4. Through discussion, the aspects of the truth held by many can be pooled and arranged to form a consensus closer to the truth than any of the sources that contributed to it. 5. This consensus is a temporary approximation of the truth, which is no sooner made than new experiences and additional information make it possible for it to be reformulated in a closer approximation of the truth by continued discussion. And 6. Thus, Western man's picture of the truth advances by successive approximations closer and closer to the whole truth without ever reaching it. And I'll just read, Quigley does not quote a lot of guys, but the one guy he takes the time to quote is Thomas Aquinas. And he says, he quotes Aquinas here, Revelation is not oracular. It doesn't come from an oracle. Propositions do not descend on us from heaven ready-made, but are more a draft of work in progress than a final and completed document for faith itself. Though rooted in immutable truth, is not crowning knowledge, and its elaboration in teaching, namely theology, is still more bound up with discourses progressively manifesting fresh truths or fresh aspects of the truth to the mind. So the individual Christian and the Christian community grow in understanding. Indeed, they must, if like other living organisms, they are to survive by adaptation to a changing environment of history, ideas, and social pressures. Now, I don't know what the Orthodox take on that would be, or even more generally, what the Orthodox take on Aquinas is. If you can speak to that,
it's not good. Well, I mean, yeah, okay. Well, I would say it's not good, but I mean, I think what he says there though is not entirely out of line. I mean, we do believe that we call, like, quite often we have this phrase, the faith once delivered to the apostles. So revelation kind of culminates with Christ, but at the same time we do continue to understand revelation in new ways that are befitting of the times. So, 2,000 years ago there wasn't such a thing as AI, there wasn't rampant pornography on the internet, there wasn't a lot of the evils that we see today. But so the evils that we see today kind of help us to understand the evil that was being revealed, even in Christ's time and before. Yeah.
We're running out of time. I'm just gonna say, the big conflict with the just to move on, the big thing that happens with the American sort of mindset is, in the late 60s, there's this awareness that things are slowing down. You had big problems with particularly gender, and I don't think Quigley is pro women's liberation in the way in like this overall massive way that it's gone. He makes he makes a number of points where, like, women are becoming too aggressive, and he talks. But one of the things is that he says in the beginning of this chapter is the American has become more used to progress. It is perfectly true that Americans now have change built into the pattern of their lives, so that saving and investment, and in general the flows of claims on wealth, what most of us call money, now go in directions that make constant change almost inevitable. So the American is really accustomed to progress and growth and wealth, and Quigley can see it's already he can see the problems. Just to really quickly, just on work and this problem that's coming, this growth of overwork, of constant tension, of frustration, of emotional life, and of leisure, began to make more and more men increasingly willing to accept death as the only method of achieving rest. Bourgeois men literally began to kill themselves by unconscious psychic suicide from overwork, neurotic overindulgence in alcohol, smoking, work, and violent leisure, and the middle class slowly increased its proportion of materially endowed women. And he goes on to say, the closely related to this confusion or even reversal of the social roles of the sexes was decreasing sexual differentiation in child-rearing practices. Was decreasing... As recently as the 1920s, girls' babies were reared differently from boys. They were dressed differently, treated differently, permitted to do different things, and admonished about different dangers. By 1960, children, regardless of sex, were all being brought up the same. This is a problem. We think these are all modern problems. A lot of these things are actually a lot older than we think. And I made this point about like Marxist professors. Marxist professors don't start in '68. They go back. They go way back into the 20s, and into the teens. By 1960, we're all being brought up the same. Indeed, with short cropped hair and play suits on both, it became impossible to be sure which was which. This led to a decrease in the personality differences of men and women, with males becoming more submissive and females becoming more aggressive. This tendency was accelerated by new techniques of education, especially in the first 12 years of life. The neurological maturation of girls was faster than that of boys, especially in regard to coordination, such as in feeding oneself, talking, dressing oneself, toilet training, learning to read, and general adjustment to school. The shift from home to school in the early grades was adjusted to by girls more easily than boys, partly because girls were more self-assured and gregarious. By the age of 10 or 12, girls were developed physically, neurologically, emotionally, and socially about 2 years in advance of boys. All this tended to make boys less self-assured, indecisive, weak, and dependent. The steady increase in the percentage of women teachers in the lower grades worked in the same direction, since women teachers favored girls and praised those attitudes and techniques that were more natural to girls. New methods, such as the whole world method of teaching, reading, or the use of true and false or multiple choice examinations, were also better adapted to female than to masculine talents. Less and less emphasis was placed on critical judgment, while more and more was placed on intuitive or subjective decisions. In this environment, girls did better, and boys felt inferior, or decided that school was a place for girls and not for boys. The growing aggressiveness of girls pushed these hesitant boys aside and intensified the problems. As consequences of this, boys had twice as many non-readers as girls, several times as many stutterers, and many times as many teenage bedwetters. As female domination becomes generation by generation a more distinctive feature of American family life, the daughter's shift of attitude to her father becomes less complete, and by adolescence she tends to pity him rather than to admire him, and may become relatively ambivalent in her feelings towards both her father and mother, sometimes hating the latter for dominating her father and despising his weakness and allowing it. I mean, there's a lot of great lines in this chapter, but it goes on and on. And I'll just give the closing bit of this section.
Well, on that, is it not normal actually, or is it kind of a recent phenomenon where girls tend to develop way faster than boys?
Yeah, there's that. A lot of that has to do. I think it's always been the case, but it's getting worse because there's a lot of chemicals out there that didn't exist prior to the First World War that accelerate accelerate these events, and also prevent the boys from properly developing in the first place. The xenoestrogens.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so but
I remember in 9th grade there was this one particular girl who was fully developed woman and was dating a guy in his 20s.
Yeah.
And the rest of us were like, wow, what chance do we have? What are we doing?
Right. I got into a conversation with a girl at the coffee shop, and I think Sensible Zoomer will back me up on this. I think I'm not that bad at sort of breaking it to women gently that all civilization is built around men having access to women. And you really want to make sure that there's one woman for every guy. Because when you don't do that, things get really bad. And the idea, sure, so the problem, Jeff, is that you, as a 9th grader, were looking at your 9th grade girl because you were being educated together every day. And you were looking at her as, you and every other boy were looking at her as a potential mate. The problem is that girls should not be given to guys their own age. I very much adhere to the Aristotelian view of this. The guys should be with women that are younger than them and significantly younger than them. And many societies do it that way because and actually where we are, it's very bad and unhealthy to have very similar aged people. So I'll give you so Aristotle. Yeah, never mind. I won't give. It sounds a bit rapey, but yeah, and it is appropriate.
Muhammad did it best. That's the boomer. Muhammad did it.
It's very appropriate to send young men into the world and say to them, "Go and build something, and then we'll give you a wife." Like the community saying that, and by suggesting that 25-year-olds should marry 25-year-olds, we're destroying the authority of the man in a lot of ways because he is not in controlling the situation as he ought to, because he is now much more dependent upon the wife. And you think about this problem of, in the economic terms, and you think about the problem of raising single families on a single income. I'm just speculating here off the top of my head. I wonder if you would have that problem if you sent men out into the workforce, and because Aristotle said a man should marry when he's 37. Now, if you said to guys, you're going to go out there and climb the ladder for 16 years. Or 15 years after you leave college, and you're going to build something, and this is the test on you to how fiscally responsible you can be and what you can put away, and also not just save, but what your annual earnings will be as a 37-year-old, and then we'll give you a 25-year-old girl. I wonder if there would be the same problems of single-family incomes, if that were the case.
And I can actually kind of attest to that, because I got married when I was 34. My wife was 25.
Okay.
And it was kind of like a very perfect timing in terms of where we were both at in our lives. So.
They often say that girls are 7 years... like mentally in advance of boys, and that certainly seemed to be the case. The girls were always ahead of the curve, and the girl, like you think it's much more common for a girl in high school to have a boyfriend in college than the other way around.
Right.
A guy who's got a girlfriend in college, I don't know whether to be really happy for him or terrified. Riding the tiger, so just to say, however, the real problem does not rest so much in theory as in practice. The real value of any society rests in its ability to develop mature and responsible individuals prepared to stand on their own feet, make decisions, and be prepared to accept the consequences of their decisions and actions without whining or self-justification. This was the ideal that the Christian tradition established long ago, and in consequence of its existence, our Western society, whatever its deficiencies, has done better than any other society that has ever existed. If it has done less well recently than earlier in its career, a disputable point of view, this weakness can be remedied only by some reform in its method of child rearing that will increase its supply of mature and responsible adults. Once this process has been established, the adults thus produced can be relied upon to adopt from our Western heritage of the past a modified ideology that will fit the needs of the present as well as the traditions of the past. And if Western civilization can do that, either in America or in Europe, it need fear no enemies from within or without. One of the things you hear often from boomers is like, nobody owes you anything. And you can listen to that last bit and think that's sort of what Quigley's saying. I really don't think it is. I believe this very strongly. You certainly are owed something. Young man leaving university, even what I just said, go work for 15 years before you look for a wife. You want to be found. The community's job is there to provide you with an appropriate job if you're prepared to work for it. And that is one of the failures that we're living through, because boomers have thrown away a lot of those opportunities of the millennials and the Zoomers to foreigners and fiscal irresponsibility and mass migration. So you're owed a country, right? You're owed a sane country to be brought into that can provide you with all that stuff. Now, the next section that Quigley talks about, I was going to talk about, but I'm not going to, and it's about Europe and the European Union, and this is a picture of de Gaulle. I'm just going to skip over it. More or less, like, Europe needs to get its act together and start being productive again and stand on its own feet, but also be, self-sustaining but supportive of America as the other half of Western civilization. This is it. I'm going to read here. I'm going to read you the last page of Tragedy and Hope. Tragedy and Hope, ? The tragedy of the period covered by this book is obvious, but the hope may seem dubious to many. Only the passage of time will show if the hope I seem to see in the future is actually there, or is the result of misobservation and self-deception. The historian has difficulty distinguishing the features of the present, and generally prefers to restrict his studies to the past, where the evidence is more freely available and where perspective helps him to interpret the evidence. Thus, the historian speaks with decreasing assurance about the nature and significance of events as they approached his own day. The time covered by this book seems to this historian to fall into three periods. The 19th century from about 1814 to about 1895. The 20th century, which did not begin until after World War II, perhaps as late as 1950. And a long period of transition from 1895 to 1950. The nature of our experiences in the first two of these periods is clear enough, while the character of the third, in which we have been only for half a generation, is much less clear. A few things do seem evident, notably that the 20th century now forming is utterly different from the 19th century, and that the age of transition between the two was one of the most awful periods in all of human history. Some, looking back on the 19th century across the horrors of the ages of transition, may regard it with nostalgia or even envy, but the 19th century was, however hopeful in its general processes, a period of materialism, selfishness, false values, hypocrisy, and secret vices. It was the workings of these underlying evils that eventually destroyed the century's hopeful qualities and emerged in all their nakedness to become dominant in 1914. Nothing is more revealing of the nature of the 19th century than the misguided complacency and optimism of 1913 and early 1914, and the misconception with which the world's leaders went on to war in August of 1914. The events of the following 30 years, from 1914 to 1945, showed the real nature of the preceding generation, its ignorance, complacency, and false values. Two terrible wars sandwiching a world economic depression revealed man's real inability to control his life by the 19th century's techniques of laissez-faire, capitalism, materialism, competition, selfishness, nationalism, violence, and imperialism. These characteristics of late 19th century life culminated in World War II, which with more than 50 million dead, 23 million of them in uniform, the rest civilians. They were killed, most of them by horrible deaths. The hope of the 20th century rests on its recognition that war and depression are man-made and needless. They can be avoided in the future by turning from the 19th century characteristics just mentioned and going back to other characteristics that our Western society has always regarded as virtues: generosity, compassion, cooperation, rationality, and foresight, and finding an increased role in human life for love, spirituality, charity, and self-discipline. We now know fairly well how to control the increase in population, how to produce wealth and reduce poverty or disease. We may in the near future know how to postpone senility and death. It certainly should be clear to those who have their eyes open that violence, extermination, and despotism do not solve problems for anyone, and that victory and conquest are delusions as well as they are merely physical and materialistic. Some things we clearly do not yet know, including the most important of all, which is how to bring up children to form them into mature, responsible adults. But on the whole, we do know now, as we have already shown, that we can avoid the continuing horrors of 1914 and 1945. On that basis alone, we may be optimistic over our ability to go back to the tradition of our Western society and to resume its development along its old patterns of inclusive diversity. Now, that last paragraph reads like the best or worst of globalist utopianism. I give Quigley credit in that I don't think he is one of those guys. I think he is saying these things out of naivety. Who can object to not wanting war? Great, but the optimism and sort of belief in a very globalist sounding system of global management is worrying and something we should be skeptical about. And as I said at the beginning, there isn't much to say about it at the moment, but because I haven't read the article where she talks about this, I've only found it in the past week or two. Quigley loses his optimism. He, in the 70s, I think he sees the world and he goes, the barbarism that I hoped would be decreasing is increasing. The problem of the genders is not going anywhere. The problem of raising children is not going anywhere. The economic problems are mounting. So it's hard to say. It's hard to.
I've got to say, it's probably for the better that he lost his optimism, because that was kind of vomit-inducing almost, the naivety that he spoke with.
Right.
About how we've progressed past barbarism and.
But in '66, is it naive? In 2024, it is. But in '66, when the Cuban Missile Crisis had happened, and the world sort of sat down, the two great superpowers, in a form of dialogue. There's this great scene of that movie I mentioned last time, 13 Days, where a guy, I think it's Robert McNamara, is in the Naval Situation Room, and this he hears this captain, the admiral, ordering the U.S. Navy to fire on this Soviet ship, and he goes, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And he doesn't realize this, but the admiral has not given the order to fire on the ships, but to fire starburst shells, which are used mainly to light up the sky at night, but they're also sort of they serve as a warning shot. And the starburst shells get shot at the Soviet ships. And the admiral goes, "I'm trying to do my job, sir, blah blah blah." But I think it is Robert McNamara. He goes, "Okay, well, look, fine. But you need to understand something, that it doesn't look like it, but President Kennedy and Khrushchev are having a conversation by deployment of ships and the way the Soviet ships are trying to run the blockade and how we're trying to interdict them. And it's a conversation the world has never seen before. And it's a really intriguing moment and thing for him to say. And if you're Quigley, and 5 years before writing this book, you sit down, you look at the world, and you go, we had a form of dialogue in which the USSR, the head of the USSR, and the head of the United States, President Kennedy and Khrushchev, in some way, without ever speaking a word to one another, had a form of communication about whether or not we were going to use nuclear weapons. And it could have easily been the start of the Third World War. And but through Western rationality, Kennedy engaged in this maneuvering and this dialogue and produced and avoided that. I just playing devil's advocate. I don't know how naive Quigley is being in 1966. I wouldn't be surprised that in the 70s he says I was being naive, but also you can say that with the benefit of hindsight, and we can say that with the benefit of hindsight in 2024. But there is some sort of hope there, and I want to be fair to him in 66. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I like him. I'm gonna be honest. Having read a lot of his stuff, the bulk of his stuff. I've read 3 of his books. I haven't read one of the book that was a manuscript. I haven't read his book of like collected articles. I like him, and I think, and I give him credit for what he thinks. I don't blame him for thinking what he thinks, and he is wrong about a lot of stuff. But I don't think he's bad. You know, like I think, I don't know. I like him. Do we have hope for the future? I don't know.
It depends on the time frame, as you always say, right? Was the line that you say?
Oh,
a black pill is a white pill taken in too short a time frame.
Yeah. And of course, the ultimate hope is Christ, and
yeah,
that is true. And when I talk about this stuff, though, I am thinking kind of like politically and historically
in our lifetime.
Yeah. But that has been tragedy and hope. I hope that there was a value that you guys got from this, short of reading it yourselves. I hope that I made some connections there for you guys that you might not have seen. But if there are any questions, I don't know what we'll do next week, but
I think there certainly was value, but for me, it was not the value that I was expecting.
What were you expecting?
Because I was expecting something really scandalous that Quigley would write about, that he would reveal a lot about, evil men in smoky back rooms at the WEF, making all kinds of deals that would, destroy future generations.
It's one of those
but
things
ultimately it seemed to be more of...
Yeah.
Ultimately, it seemed to be more of or less so of like evil men doing evil schemes. Or there was some of that, but then also there was this other element of kind of fallen humans doing fallen things.
Right. We have this conversation fairly regularly, right? And are these guys Bond villains, or are they actually responding to systems and structures in understandable ways? Is it actually more some sort of runaway train? Yeah. I don't know. I can't think of how to put it at the moment. But yeah.
Jonathan Pageau had this video last week about giants, and one way to understand what giants symbolize is a creature with too much body and not enough head. Or like the head is disproportionately small compared to the body. And that's one way I think that's pretty helpful to understand a lot of organizations and institutions that exist today, is that they're run mainly by body with very little guiding force at the top, or not enough.
To give a similar thing like that, Bruno Latour talks about modernity as producing monsters, and a monster is something, in Latour's language, is something that man is able to create but not control. And so a monster is like Chernobyl, in that it's Frankenstein, right? Dr. Frankenstein can create Frankenstein's monster, but he can't control it. And then at the end, the question is, well, who was the monster on one level, but also that the monster could not be controlled. So...
Yeah, and another element of that is that monsters take on a life of their own.
Yeah.
And that's something that we see with a lot of technology and a lot of systems that we put in place
to put it in
world.
To put it in philosophical terms, just because this is how it's articulated. Monsters have agency. They have the ability to act.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean that they need to be thinking either. But they have the ability to act because they're so big and they have so much power behind them that they do things that smaller scale events don't. So a classic example of a monster is the LA River. And the LA River has been concreted up into... If you've seen just about any movie from the 90s, you've seen a car chase down the LA River basin when it's dried up. And what the LA River does is it prevents flooding until it doesn't. Because when the really, really big flood comes, actually having that concreted up river will create a worse level of flood than if it hadn't been there. And what it means is that the monster is able to do something that had a smaller river wouldn't do. So it has an ability to act. It has this agency that a smaller thing, very much like it, wouldn't do. Yeah. It's, I mean, it's... I have now read Tragedy and Hope effectively twice.
Blotto wants to know what's the book about, ultimately.
I said it a number of times. The book is about the third age of conflict and what indicators and what hope there might be for a fourth age of expansion. So sort of like, I think he's hoping people like Bill Clinton will read it. Not that he knew who Bill Clinton was going to be, but that someone like Bill Clinton would read it and understand it and try and avoid the mistakes. And, you know, to Bill Clinton's credit, I think he has a fairly... If he was majorly influenced by Carroll Quigley, as he says he was, I think that Bill Clinton has a rather honest interpretation of Quigley. I think that the Clinton administration, the Clinton presidency, represents in a lot of ways a genuine effort to embody the virtues and avoid the vices that Quigley proposes. Now, whether or not the Clinton regime does that out of the same honest naivety, or whether it does it for more nefarious purposes, is another matter.
Laurentian wants to chime in with a hot take.
As usual.
He says, Yeah. His hot take is that we were on this road regardless. It's the competition between organizations and institutions. I don't know if nations matter anymore.
I don't know that Quigley would entirely disagree with you, because I don't know if you were here for it. I read a bit out where he talks about the sort of the growth of the company, and I think Quigley would be open to the suggestion that just as in China and Russia, they became the party took over the state, the party took over the civilization in some ways, that the company can take over the civilization too. So you could very well be right. Bro Leaf, that mentality is what Quigley describes as Africanization, being for the family and not for the nation. I know what you mean.
It's a type of atomization or disintegration.
Yeah, disintegration. The death of like obligations to one another. So, I don't know if there really is. If we had, this is something to think about. There are 18 people watching. If we had a very active chat, I would suggest doing like a long question episode next time, or maybe not a long one, maybe just like questions and chatting, but I'm not sure that is really justified. It depends. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe we'll go through and see what the comments are on the videos in a couple of weeks, and put something together out of that. But I don't know. So next week, if we go next week, because I might need. I'm not sure. I don't really have something definitive in my mind. On Fridays, I'm working through the last of Quigley on his like little one-off chapters on civilizations in the evolution of civilizations. So there's a bit more Quigley on Fridays if you can't get enough Quigley. But next week, Jeff, I might plan a break next week. I haven't decided yet. I gotta see how I feel tomorrow when I wake up. But if the next time we go, there's a few options. Laurentian has asked me to do something on Hobbes, and you suggested something on the English Civil War, and actually those two would actually go quite well together, because Hobbes is formed by the English Civil War. Leviathan comes out of Sensible Zoomer. It would not be an hour. It would be a similar 34-hour series if you wanted me to do Latour. So maybe a little double header over 2 weeks on
it seems like
Civil War and then Leviathan.
Nothing ever is an hour on the internet anymore. Not in the right wing sphere, at least. When was the last time you saw a 1 hour stream on a topic?
So look, here's what I'm doing, and I feel like there is a gap. There's a sort of I'm never like satisfied. We always get the introductions. We never get the like in-depth like college level course on things. And I find lots of like introductory conversations on stuff like Tragedy and Hope that are great. They're very high quality, but they don't go there aren't things on the next level. And what I've done here is I've kind of made, over these 17 episodes, the content that I want to consume. I want to find someone's like in-depth analyses. Now maybe I went too far, and maybe that's Tragedy and Hope itself, but it is yet to be seen whether or not there's actually a demand for this besides me. The fact that I would want something like this, and whether or not you guys want something like this. So that's the problem. I don't know what to.
Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, I can do whatever. I'm happy to do whatever, but it's difficult to know what's working and what doesn't. Like, what's for my benefit, what's for your benefit. And it helps if you guys, I mean, obviously, share this, but yeah. And as Jeff said, there's been this slight downtick in the number of views, so I don't know if it's working or not. Wow, this sounds crazy, but we did the first episode 8 months ago. It says on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, if nothing else, I think we've got a good rhythm down now. I think rhythm was our big problem, but
yeah, and I got to commend you for really growing into the role of being a very competent presenter, very well prepared. So
I don't think I'm that well prepared. I just have a lot of stuff sitting in my head to throw out in the moment. Too much stuff. But I've enjoyed it. Yeah, so maybe the next one we'll do is the English Civil War, and then the one after that we'll do Hobbes. How long there's so many books that I would love to take months reading to do this, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to more or less go with my rough outline in my head of the English Civil War, and then I'm going to fill it in with some bits and pieces where I need to refresh. But again,
because I got to say, you really went off in book club in the first meeting, in the first book club that we had about the Royalist Revolution. So that I thought it'd be great if you did a presentation on it.
I can't remember what I went off about now. Anyway,
we'll go back and figure it out.
This has been long. It's the last one, but yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed it. And let me find some good music. I'm gonna, it has nothing to do, again, with Tragedy and Hope, or even with the Final Fantasy VII music I played at the beginning. I'm just gonna play it because I like this, and because I can, if YouTube works. This was probably my fun and this is my favorite song I played for this. So thanks for coming, guys, and we'll see you next week.